The Irish Diaspora. The potato, the loss of which was the match that ignited the gunpowder that set off one of the worst humanitarian crises in history. But why was the potato so important? The best answer to this is found on the website Eyewitness to History in the Irish Potato Famine, 1847. At first, the potato seemed heaven-sent. It thrived in the damp Irish climate, was easy to grow, and produced a high yield per acre. In the period from 1780 to 1845, it helped double the Irish population from 4 to 8 million. However, with this population explosion came an increased demand for land. The only solution was to divide the available parcels into even smaller plots for each succeeding generation. Soon, the diminished size of these plots dictated the planting of potatoes, as it was the only crop that could produce a significant yield of food on such limited acreage. By 1840s, fully one-third of Ireland's population was totally dependent on the potato for its nourishment. However, it is important to mention that Ireland wasn't entirely dependent on potatoes. Other crops were being grown, especially grains, but they were not being grown in the quantities necessary to feed a country. Another main source of nourishment was the pig. While it does not seem connected to the famine, pigs have to eat something, and in Ireland's case, that something was potatoes. Now you know there was going to be a disaster with this terrible combination. However, assisted, it would have been a lot better. The call for assistance can be seen clearly in the Washington Union, an American newspaper which published an article on November 23, 1845, saying, "What is to be done in this unlooked-for emergency? Open the ports," is the exclamation, and there stands the shivering premier, like a reed in the wind, paralyzed between affection for his sliding scale and the horrors of public famine. This piece is saying that the premier is taking time to decide on a solution, debating between money and saving lives. Another problem is what the article, "What Caused the Irish Potato Famine," states. In fact, the most glaring cause of the famine was not a plant disease, but England's long-running political hegemongy over Ireland. The English conquered Ireland several times and took ownership of a vast agricultural territory. Large chunks were given to Englishmen. This is the basic starting position. From there, the managers then rented small plots to the local population in return for labor and cash crops. Competition for land resulted in high rise and small plots, thereby squeezing the Irish to subsistence and providing a large financial drain on the economy. A way the British declared their innocence is something called the Methuselah Law of Population. The way they saw it, the Irish then paid for their sins via the starvation and disease that the famine wrought. Now, there was a problem in Ireland before the famine, with the large jumping population. However, this is because England had placed Ireland in an unusual position as the breadbasket for the Industrial Revolution. Believe it or not, the English did try and do something. However, these attempts ended up having the opposite effect. Far from allowing the market to work, England launched a massive program of government intervention, which consisted mainly of building workhouses, most completed just prior to the onset of the famine. However, as said later, the workhouses, an early version of the New Deal Make Work programs, only made the problem of poverty worse. A system of extensive public works required heavy taxation on the local economy. English officials directed money away from projects that would have increased productivity and agricultural output into useless road building. Most of these roads began nowhere and ended nowhere. Worse yet, the policy established by Sir Charles Trevelyan to pay below market wages, which you can imagine were pretty low, which meant that the workers earned less food than the caloric energy they typically expended in working on the roads. However, this is not the only reason for lack of support. The British and Irish hated each other. In fact, there had been many revolutions before the famine. The reason for these revolutions, and the main reason for lack of support, was the difference in religion. Because of that difference in religion, and the fact that Ireland had been defeated over and over again in revolutions, gave the British power, which allowed the Irish to be treated as second-class citizens. It was along the lines, if you can defeat them, you can rule them. Following the Field Wolfe Tones Rebellion in 1798, England extended its control by passing the 1800 Act of Union that dissolved the Irish Parliament. At this point, the Irish were tired of being treated like second-class citizens and provided with no help, not to mention the low problem of starving to death. The former Irish population of 8 million had thus fallen by at least 2 million. It explains that this number comes from death and immigration. The only option that the Irish saw was to leave.
And the United Kingdom affected during this famine. Well, the famine led to increased religious opposition in Ireland during the famine. In fact, a letter from an Irishman wrote to his cousin in the U.S. talks about his life in Ireland. In one part, he talks about religious opposition against the British. He says, "Dear cousin, there is great changes in Ireland, present and in England. Account of our religion, the Pope sent a cardinal to England and to Ireland. The government is striving to put down our religion, but it is too strong to be touched." As you see, a real person living in Ireland at the time is saying that the British are trying to put down their religion, and it was too strong to put down. This is another reason why this is another part of how the British control Ireland at the time. Another great effect of this famine is the death toll in Ireland at the time. There is a source that says the death toll varies from 500,000 people dead to 1.5 million people dead. This is a lot for the time, and this greatly affects Ireland's population in the long run, which we'll talk about it later in this podcast.
Those who stayed in England, voluntarily or not, would continue to suffer even after fleeing their country. Many enticed by the prospect of work and relief through the English poor law system, considerable numbers traveled to the major towns and cities of northwest England, to cities such as Liverpool and Lancashire. Though many would become trapped in England, as many people had exhausted their fares for passage to America while waiting to depart, become too ill to travel, or fell victim to criminals who preyed upon their inexperience and exhaustion. Many were not even able to cross over to England, as on most ships, poor provisions, physical environment, and disease related to the journey assured that many remaining susceptibilities of old age, illness, or youth were again tested. Even many healthy individuals would end up sick when they arrived. Problems for these immigrants would not stop, and many would get worse. One account of the time notes, the migrants who arrived in Liverpool in the first 6 months of 1847, as 80,000 located themselves in tunnels and cellars, and remained to gut the labor market and propagate a wretched model of life. In this unhappy year, 60,000 persons were attacked with fever, and 40,000 with dysentery. Irish immigrants years later would find themselves typically poor, single, working hard jobs for little money, and lacking any kind of family support. At best times, they were cheap labor, and at poor economic times, they would often be the first to lose their jobs.
What did the British do during the famine? They didn't do much, but they still helped, if that makes sense. The British government failed to prevent the famine. How did they do this, you may ask? Well, let's look at their policies. The British government helped by building infrastructure in Ireland. In fact, they built public works in 1831 using the funds of £500,000 at the time. And they added additional £50,000 to that. So the British government did invest in Ireland, but it wasn't all so good. These public works led to widespread corruption. Landlords that had land before that were employing people would take their sons themselves into these public works, and that would make the poor people unemployed.
When Irish immigrants moved to the U.S., they were treated very poorly at first. Most of the immigrating Irish were poor, so couldn't afford nice transportation. Rats and disease were common on the transport ships. Stephen de Vere, a philanthropist who traveled in early 1847 during the largest wave of immigrants, said that hundreds of poor people, men, women, and children of all ages, from driving idiot of 90 to the babe just born, huddled together without air, wallowing in filth and breathing a fetid atmosphere, sick in body, disparate in heart, dying without a voice of spiritual consolation, and buried deep without the rites of the church. Around 1.3 out of the 4.5 million Irish immigrants traveling to the U.S. died, and the ones that did arrive suffered massive discrimination once they came. The main reason of the discrimination was mostly because of the Irish being Catholic, and Catholics were not welcomed by the Protestant populace of the eastern seaboard. Soon, this hatred spread.
But what happened to those who left to Canada? Initially, it seemed optimistic, but soon would turn into a tragedy. There had been steady Irish immigration to Canada for almost 15 years, but would see substantial increase during the famine. Prior to the famine, Canadian opinion on Irish immigration was often positive. While initially being a Catholic Irish immigrant was frowned upon, soon they were tolerated as an important part of the workforce. During the famine, though, the socially acceptable Catholic Irish were nowhere to be found. Most Canadians during the famine were excited because an influx of laborers meant more frontier expansion and a stronger economy. But the Irish immigrants that arrived were largely sick, destitute, and unable to work after they recovered from illness. This started to increase on an even larger scale in 1847 because landlords started sending many Irish people to the Americas on very cheap ships, which had similar conditions to those who were crossing England. There was in fact a roughly 20% mortality rate among immigrants on the ship. When immigrants did arrive, they were met with underwhelming help. Irish immigrants would be quarantined at Grosso Island for 2 weeks. The island was vastly underprepared for this, as by 23rd of May, the hospital on Grosso Island, set up with 250 beds, was inundated with 695 sick and dying individuals, most of whom were laid upon straw mats on the shore or in hastily constructed fever sheds. With limited government support, the poor immigrants would move to the cities, bringing diseases with them. With the Irish unable to contribute to society and bringing disease and death along with them, it promoted much racism and discrimination. Canadian society turned generally nativist and very anti-Catholic. Some Protestant monks even went to Quebec City and Montreal, largely Catholic cities at the time, and incited riots by preaching anti-Catholic speeches.
Similar to Canada, the government of Australia wanted some Irish to help expand the frontier. Although very differently from Canada, many of the Irish immigrants that immigrated to Australia traveled in sanitary conditions. For decades at this point, immigration to those eligible were assisted by bounties. These bounties would assist travel costs as ships and crews were paid by the government to bring individuals who tended to be skilled laborers or single women to the colony, and prices would vary according to these factors. During the famine, not much changed in this pattern of immigration. Operations surrounding immigration only allowed eligible people to immigrate if they were not coming from prison ships. Again, the same single women and skilled laborers. Just as before, potential immigrants had to apply, be selected, and approved. This idea was to satisfy the labor needs in the colony and was not designed to relieve distress in Great Britain or Ireland. But what was eligible was loosened a bit. 3% of the total number of Irish embarked between 1848 and 1850 would not have qualified under the commissioner's normal selection criteria. But when really was the Irish diaspora, and how did it affect Irish history?
The Irish diaspora has existed since the Middle Ages. but the majority of it can only be traced back to the 1700s. Most of the thought to leave Ireland around this time comes from the Irish potato famine, or discrimination coming from the British. According to WesleyJohnson.com, Irish immigration to the places outside the British Isles before the famine was in the ballpark of about 15,000 people leaving per year. But between 1847 and 1852, 1 million people left, 200,000 a year. And in total, during the whole 6-year famine and the following 4 years, 1.5 people have fled Ireland for refuge away from Great Britain's rule, which is 150 million Irish men, women, and children fleeing every year for 10 years. Slowly, Ireland's population has increased, but it is far away from being to its pre-1848 population.